Hello, I'm Tim Lang from City University, and we're hosting this. This is the fourth of a series of ESRC funded seminars, which Stefan miraculously pulled together with a ne'er-do-well bunch of Edinburgh, Essex, Cardiff and City. Stefan is a prof at Essex. And the idea was very simple, that we get academics and civil society to meet and talk about the future of food.
Yeah, that's right. And I was delighted when Tim said he's very happy to piggyback the ESRC seminar series onto the food research collaboration, which he and his City team is leading. And so we've been collaborating for the last 2 years, and I think it's been working really well. We had wonderful events at Cardiff, in Edinburgh, as well as Essex, and tomorrow we're meeting to see what we want to do next. But it's been wonderful. Thank you, Tim, and the whole City team for putting up another room full of interesting people and hopefully interesting presentations. So thank you. Welcome, everyone.
Well, thank you. We're going to, you will have seen, has everyone got the brochure? You've got it. Planning this, we actually really thought very hard about it. What do we want from it? What could we do with it? At one level, this is the last of the series. The first one was on food and work. The second was on food and place. Terry Marsden, who's standing up, wandering down the middle, organised that. Hello, Terry, from Cardiff. Antonio in Edinburgh organised one on politics of nutrition and health. This last one, in a sense, pulls a lot of that together because it's looking at food and corporations. One of the things we agreed is we wanted to talk about power. One of the areas where there's mutual interest between academia and civil society is exploring power. So we're doing that really as today's theme. You'll see how it's organised. It's all here. In this pad you've got here, you've got a list of everyone who's here or said they're coming. You've got the biographies of everyone. I'm not going to do big introductions of people. Everyone's got half an hour, okay, for it. So each slot. The first one, Michael Heasman here and I pulled together. We thought we ought to actually just do one paper which essentially tries to get us on the same page. What are corporations? What are the food corporations? Who are they? And Michael and I have done a handout, good old style Polytechnic lecturer handout. It begins there. This is because some of this is impossible to put on PowerPoint. We've listed literally, I think, the most useful document on literally the corporate shape of Britain. Our focus is on Britain, but not entirely. And you'll see, if you can read that, the value added of each of the sectors, the number of companies there are in each sector, the number of employees. It's in one slide, an amazing overview of where the money goes in the UK food system. On the next sheet, the world's top 100 food companies, then some further ones. We could have given you a lot more, but we haven't. And in the first talk, Michael is going to whiz through some of our thinking on it. Is everyone happy? Rules of engagement sorted? Ding, ding. Michael.
Thank you very much, Tim. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. They're big, they're bad, some say. They're definitely powerful, and they have their vulnerabilities. Who are these strange creatures, these strange beasts? Well, today we're going to be talking about food and beverage corporations. And so Tim and myself are going to just try and give some pointers, raise some questions, and do some introductory sort of comments to try and set the scene for the rest of the day. As Tim said, there's a handout with our slides because Tim likes to put a lot of detail in, and so I'm not going to go through all of the detail through the presentation, but just highlight some points, to draw our attention to different issues. And in this way, we're going to try and sort of give an introduction to the companies that dominate the UK scene, some of the dynamics that drive the corporate world, and such as their role in mediating labour, technology and consumers. And then we're going to sort of explore what Tim and myself are calling some vulnerabilities. And then finally, we want to raise some issues for the academic world and civil society when it comes to perhaps collaborating in the area of food corporations. And just to give an example of these types of beasts that are out there, just last week, to time this better, Heinz and Kraft announced that they are merging together to create a new sort of, to create a new $25 billion corporation, become the 5th largest food company in the world. And these are the sort of issues that we're trying to sort of confront and understand when we talk about food corporations. So, but first, I just wanted to, sort of remind ourselves, basically, why do food companies remain popular? Why do we even have food companies? For the majority of us, majority of consumers, we rely on food business of one sort or another to feed us these days. So in that sense, their role is very central to the food system and food supply. And, and in terms, how this is taught to undergraduates, and, they preserve and make food, edible and palatable. Sort of we've overcome through the work of food business, climate and seasonal issues. Some people claim that it increases our consumer choice, makes food safe. We have a lot of concern about whether the cost of food, sort of about the transporting food around global networks. And, and there is that element, food is social, that, sort of food business is very central to making food more interesting. And also, we don't want, many of us don't want the drudgery of preparing our food in the same way as we did, in times past. So it replaces domestic labour. And also in the social scene, sort of food creates this, the food business creates this whole imagery around, sort of their activities and their actions. There's this terrible American word that, particularly in food service, that it's all about eat-attainment, rather than entertainment. And of course, they are big employers. In the UK, 3.6 million people are employed in the food sector, one of the biggest employers in the country. And with that comes a lot of political clout and support. So who are these sort of food companies? When we talk about food corporations, who are Tim and myself talking about? We just want to sort of briefly sort of highlight, some global European Union and UK perspectives. And I think one thing that is sort of peculiar to food as a sector is that many of the companies are extremely old. Unlike our modern sort of media landscape like Twitter, Facebook, the smartphone, which has basically all come about in the past 10 years or so, some of these companies go back to Victorian times, the 1800s. Perhaps the more newer big players are the retailers, which started to emerge particularly after the Second World War. And now you see that some of these corporations have become huge. And so the top 10 food companies, they now sort of, you can't see right down there, they're responsible for 15% of global food sales and combined have a turnover of approaching $500 million US. And not only is it just the companies themselves, often many of the big players in the food sector are almost hidden. They're providing sort of, the meals that get served up in food service or in restaurants and so on. But we also see that, the big players, they own literally hundreds and hundreds of branded products. And often it's not very easy to identify, sort of who, owns what within this sort of massive activity. And these sort of brands are sold and sort of marketed globally by these types of corporations. If I just sort of focus, just to hone in a bit more on the European Union food and beverage manufacturing sector. Again, in terms of manufacturing, this is one of the largest manufacturing sectors in the European Union. They employ more than 4 million people, have a turnover of around €1 trillion. But the important thing here, when we talk about corporations, those big, powerful corporations, is that out of the 286,000 food businesses in the European Union manufacturing food, less than 1%, 0.9% of those are really big, giant companies. And that 0.09% account for roughly half of all of European food sales. And if you combine them with the medium-sized companies, this is defined as, big companies over 250 employees, medium 50 to 250, I think. If you combine the two together, large and small, they account for 3/4 of all food employment in the European Union. And these are sort of like the drivers, the lead companies that help shape that. But then up behind that are literally tens of thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is as much of the food business and food industry as well. Lots of these smaller companies operating, often very innovative. And the average company in the European Union only has 16 or less employees. And so they get this character, you've got the giants and all of these like minnows, around them. And this is just something from Food and Drink Europe, the trade association. And this is like food R&D, but they've just tried to look at this, the drivers of innovation. You can't sort of see this, it's on the slide. But here, surprisingly, is pleasure. So we have to remind us of the social aspect of food.
All the slides will be on the website.
Yeah. And so it's like looking at sensory qualities, sophistication, some of the things that might concern Tim and myself, like ecology, solidarity, and so on, they're right down there in terms of the food and drink innovation in Europe.
Is safety anywhere?
Safety?
No.
No. Can't see. Easy to handle sophistication. I think the question was, is there safety there? I think safety is often a given, in terms of doing the food, perhaps not driven in terms of innovation in this case. But obviously there is a lot of, I suppose, research and development to ensure safe food. Yeah. And then the other thing, if you look at the main sectors, it's like dairy, ready-to-eat meals, soft drinks, perhaps all of the areas in which we might be concerned about, perhaps from a nutritional or other sort of concerns around the food sector. So let's just sort of think about what's going on in the UK. We're obviously the first industrial nation, so the origins of modern industrial food as often can be traced back to the mid-1800s. But unfortunately the UK has a long history of not feeding itself, which continues to this very day. Only around 53% of the food in today's modern food system in the UK is produced within the UK. So we're hugely reliant on other countries to produce our food. And in fact, 24 countries in total produce 90% of our food. And this is the DEFRA, Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, so in the handout. And the point that Tim and myself tried to make here, while there's a lot of focus on agriculture, in terms of gross value added, it's the food manufacturers and of course the caterers and retailers who are the drivers and where the money is made. And in terms of the total household spend on food, 196 billion, that these days roughly splits, not quite 50-50, but almost between retail sector, supermarkets, and food service, catering, restaurants. So we're very much a divided nation in that sense of where we get our food. So let's just turn to perhaps some of the dynamics that you can sort of identify in the literature. And here it's very important in terms of to look at the concentration across, globally, but also mergers and acquisitions. We see battles within and between sectors. And I think sort of for myself and for Tim, we're particularly interested in the way in which, at the bottom there, food corporations are able to shape and influence policy and the environment to their benefit. So how do corporations stay powerful? I mentioned that they're powerful. How do they do that? Well, if you speak to food businesses, they quite naturally, they tell you, that old marketing slogan that they're there to, meet, consumer needs and wants. And you have to sort of accept that that is part of the, way that, we engage with food companies as consumers. But also, I think many of us in this room would argue they also mould those needs and wants. They shape them. And then to myself, thought, well, what other areas are, do corporations have power? And we just came up with some examples which we think sort of, illustrate that there's a lot else going on other than needs and wants and markets. And we've summarised ones that we've come up with. We talk about capital, tax avoidance, fixing the rules, lobbying, the market power, of course, and also soft power. And so I'm just going to briefly sort of explain some of those to you. So capital, the role of money within the food system is really critical, where you can capture value added and profitability, particularly in global supply chains. That is becoming a sort of, the global value chain analysis type approach. That is becoming very critical in terms of how not just food, but many industries these days capture money within sort of food in supply chains. And we can see that also in terms of the Heinz Kraft. It was driven mainly by hedge funds, and a different type of capital. And also is the problem of the short-termism, particularly in UK capitalism, but also in other countries. And sort of Tim in particular, so he brought up the issue of tax avoidance, sort of a very topical issue, but we don't hear so much about it in the food sector, but that is also important. And there's not much written about this, but there's two reports. Action Aid have done something about sweet nothings. It's not just tax avoidance in the UK or in Europe. This shows how a UK company, avoids tax in terms of its sourcing its sugar, in this case in an African country. And then this recent report from War on Want about McDonald's in Europe, and they've estimated that through the way in which McDonald's structures their financial arrangements, you taking advantage of global regimes and European rules, they've avoided up to €1 billion in tax. And sort of in the slides, we've given some sort of background detail from that very recent study. And of course, for us, sort of in the world of food policy, we're very concerned about fixing the rules, how policy is shaped. And I think the point that Tim and myself want to make here is that this is not a brand new process. This is something that's gone on many, many years, for decades. And you only have to look at the history of some of our food and see that very close collaboration at times between perhaps the state and corporations. One of in the old days, I did a lot of work on sugar, and you can see almost 100-year history of, I would perhaps go as far as to say, almost collusion between state interests and the sugar industry. And that continues to that continues to this day, when we're seeing the emergence of things like this new supposedly trade deal, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and we can see that the agro-food industries are really right in that and helping to shape that to their advantage. But also perhaps in terms of one of the most important areas, and there has been work done this, but we perhaps need more, is the way in which major powerful corporations, retailers, or even sort of traders shape global standards. They're making the demands. They set the standards which others have to apply to. And of course, as we've seen with Tesco and other examples, they then sort of charge their suppliers for the privilege of engaging in those standards.
We've got the grocery adjudicator, by the way, coming in, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
What's going on at the moment. So should be interesting.
We also have an example of lobbying. One calculation is that almost €1 billion was spent in trying to defeating the introduction of traffic light labelling scheme. Obviously in the UK we have the so-called responsibility deals, and how industry can sort of shape that agenda, and people talk about going to the lowest common denominator rather than raising standards. This is something which, ever since I've known Tim, he's been very concerned about this issue, the moulding of consumer consciousness, particularly as we see a focus on advertising and marketing spend. But also today, I think is the changing media landscape, the social media that's becoming more and more important. But also this has been, I think, sort of one area where there has been a bit of an Achilles heel for the food sector. I think sort of public health has been hugely successful in identifying, the sort of and highlighting the marketing of foodstuffs, of basically junk food to children. And I think this has been a very successful, engagement in terms of trying to sort of, hold food companies to account. And this is probably one of the few areas when I look at it where I've seen the food sector on the back hill. They're fighting back, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this, but I think this has been a very successful campaign. And then we have the rise of the prosumer. This is sort of explained in Tim and Yanni Gabriel's new book, or third edition of The Unmanageable Consumer. Was that coming out, Tim, later this year? Yeah. And this is about how, again, we are working for free for corporations. We pack our food, we pick it up ourselves, and increasingly through social media, we're almost having a conversation with the food industry and giving them all our information, because we think we get some benefits. So you see the role of big data, social media, and this is reshaping particularly the food and consumer corporation. And you can see, particularly you go back to the child, marketing of foodstuffs to children, this has become a really perhaps problematic area, to be sort of polite, in terms of what food companies are now doing. So public frameworks, is the state listening? What's the role of the state? There are areas of intervention, competition, planning, labour roles, education and training, science and technology. So there are sort of things going on. So I now turn to this vulnerability. What is it that Tim and myself mean by vulnerabilities? And in this case, we're trying to sort of look at some of the risks, the areas, where there's, opportunity for some sort of, deeper analysis and engagement. And in this sense, we think there's some, structural, vulnerabilities. And perhaps you can see that in terms of the promiscuous consumer, with the rise of the big German giants, Aldi and Lidl, threatening UK retailers. But also, let's not lose sight that Aldi and Lidl are giant retailers in themselves. They're some of the most globally orientated retailers. Both of them are in the top 10 world's largest retailers. Only Tesco from the UK figures in the top 10 global retailers. So let's not think of them as some sort of little, sort of David taking on Goliaths. I think it's important to do that. We've seen volatility on global markets and supply chains. As talked about, in the UK, the global decline in self-sufficiency. You're seeing new consumer expectations, such as urban consumption. More than 70% of us now live in urban or suburban areas. For me, in particular, it's very important to not lose sight and engage with the problem of poverty and inequality and how that impacts on our food system. And we have increasingly a low-wage food economy for large parts of the people working in the food sector.
That's why we've got two speakers here from the Labour side today. We thought that was essential.
Yeah, and we're not sort of dwelling on this area, but again, the whole of the food sector and agriculture and agribusiness is hugely challenged and at risk from the environmental issues around sort of the future of food. And here, it's the perfect storm of climate change, water stress, and energy use with food in the middle. And these are sort of becoming critical issues for and risk to the food sector. And then sort of at the consumption end, increasingly, so we hear a new sort of supposed dialogue and rhetoric of transparency. So we had a trust crisis, particularly from BSC in the 90s, but now it's all about transparency. But I think you only have to sort of study this area, and Tim and myself would suggest that there's also a counter trend of increasing secrecy, complexity, difficulty of access, and to actually be able to find out what you'd really like to find out about the food sector. Just try and visit a food factory. You see how hard that is. And so we have then problems of accountability and monitoring as a key issue. And of course, civil society has been at the forefront of some of these activities. And also, another sort of important issue in food is authenticity. So food companies are having to engage with that as consumers. We want some authenticity and transparency, where our food is, what our food is, how it's made, and so on. So this is a potential battleground here. So just to finish with, we've just raised, some issues perhaps for or challenges for civil society and academia, just as discussion points, we realise this is not an all exclusive list. There's other points to consider. And what we see, why this has become more problematic perhaps in more recent history, is that the political environment has been more one about partnerships and collaboration. And we could say that there are some advantages to this. For example, regulatory approaches are often very cumbersome and long-winded, so voluntary self-regulation is potentially a quick solution. And if you look at some of the work that groundbreaking work that something like organisations like WWF are doing, and they say effective. If you want to change companies, work with them. There's other people who say you can't work with corporations. So even within civil society type sort of approaches, there's a wide dialogue and different way of engaging with food. There's the self-interest, corporations, there's transparency, there's authenticity. But there are big questions, does this actually work? Has there been progress on diet and health and the environment, for example? And you can perhaps find, examples either way, depending on where you look. And also, this is the issue that food corporations, in this sense, become like, the new government in which we live, in which we have a hollowed-out state. But there's also this case for scepticism around this partnership, collaborative approach. In terms of when it comes to power, who sets the terms and agenda for collaboration? And also the financial, perhaps, dependency may not be in hard cash, but in terms of resources, having the resources to carry out things. And then the politics of it. If working in collaborative areas, does this perhaps give NGOs less room for manoeuvre? Who's going to hold the corporations to account when we're all collaborating? So it becomes a sort of a difficult issue to try and unpack. And should UK NGOs openly push for regulation? This again is, should we regulate, self-regulate, or leave it to the market? These are sort of, again, I think ongoing concerns and issues. And then this becomes a more fundamental role about democracy and the role of the state. What should be that role of the state or governance in terms of addressing some of the, the bigger public and societal issues that we need to engage with. And in terms of issues for academia, are we, because I'm an academic, are we giving NGOs what they need to know? And I think the food research collaboration is trying to, sort of create a framework to engage with that. But also, as well as understanding NGO and civil society activities, how do we take into account wider public opinion and wider sort of trends within sort of among consumers? And also how are we working with industry? Universities, those of you in universities all know we're under increasing pressure to shape our research activities and many of our other activities around industry agendas or collaborations. And, and I think that becomes very problematic. And again, I can think of many examples in my own institution, and I'm sure you can in your own. So what is the role of public research, when it comes to squeezed university funds? And also, again, big on the agenda in universities, it's all about, employability, getting students into jobs, working with industry, engaging with industry. So there's some sort of issues there around the public and the industry agendas. And also in this sense, universities are under increasing pressure to demonstrate their impact. So perhaps we need to sort of think about how working with civil society or NGO organisations, we can demonstrate impact, collaboratively in that respect. So just to conclude, in the sort of emerging in the 80s and into the 90s, in the academic world, there was a very rich literature that started to emerge, exploring food corporations, their power, their supply chains under the so-called food systems approach, or the political economy of food. And people like Terry Marsden, who's speaking later, were pioneers in this sort of area. But but I think that agenda's got lost a bit. Perhaps we need a reinvent, how we sort of engage academically with the corporate world. And in that respect, both Tim and myself think there is fertile terrain for joint work by academics and civil society. And we also have a shared problem about who's responsible, the responsibility, particularly the role of the state. And we'd also suggest that we need to sort of explore this issue of what we're calling the vulnerabilities, and to work more on this, and to sort of see the relationship between different vulnerabilities and risk in particular. And the last point is not one I would make. This is from Tim. He just says that we all have to work harder. So thank you very much. My work is done.